Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Kshama Sawant.
And I'm Kaylin Nicholson. Support for the Israeli state's genocidal war on Gaza is crumbling. A majority of Americans now oppose the war, and just 36% support the U.S. providing military aid to Israel to fund this onslaught, which Biden and both the Democratic and Republican parties have done to the tune of billions of dollars. The Israeli military has now killed more than 37,000 Palestinians, nearly 1 out of every 50 people in Gaza. Nearly 1 out of every 15 have been injured by Israel's attacks, and nearly the entire population has been displaced. As our guest last week, Nick Cruz of Revolutionary Blackout Network, discussed, there was a particularly barbaric attack last week, with the Israeli military disguising soldiers as aid workers in an operation that killed more than 270 Palestinians, nearly a quarter of them children. This is one of the most stunning atrocities of the war so far, and highlights the urgent need for the antiwar movement to have a strategy to win. If you haven't already, you should definitely watch our interview with Joe Sugru, a member of the Washington Education Association, who talked about how working and young people can continue building the anti-war movement. Joe talked about the importance of rank-and-file members fighting for their unions to rescind their endorsements of warmonger-in-chief Biden, as Joe and his fellow WEA members did at their recent Union State Convention. To continue the conversation, we're joined today by Joan Wright, a socialist and queer activist in Seattle and a member of Workers Strike Back. She's also a rank-and-file member of OPEIU Local 153, the Union of Workers at Kickstarter Corporation. Joan has been organizing against the war in her union, where she and other workers have recently been successful in winning a ceasefire resolution against the war on Gaza.
Working people continue to be rightly horrified by the genocidal war on Gaza, and protests have continued, including a historic strike by nearly 16,000 academic and graduate workers at the University of California. These campus workers, who are organized with the UAW union, launched their strike in May to oppose the university administration's brutal crackdown on campus anti-war protests earlier this year. The strike was forced to end on June 7th because of a court injunction, which is no surprise given that the courts under capitalism rarely come down on the side of working people. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's political coalition between the far right and other sections of the political establishment is fraying. Netanyahu was forced to dissolve his war cabinet following the resignation of Benny Gantz, a major right-wing political figure who was perceived as a moderating force to the even more hard right wing in the government. Mass anger is growing in Israel at the policies prolonging the war, and protests erupted in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv last week, demanding Netanyahu's resignation. And as we have said before on this broadcast, ordinary Israelis continue to face an ongoing and worsening cost of living crisis, with inflation surging as a result of the war. Biden and the Democrats have done nothing to stop the slaughter, even as the crimes of Netanyahu and the Israeli war machine pile up. Biden has spent billions on the war, but they can't solve the basic problems facing working people in the US, like the ongoing cost of living crisis here. This betrayal by the Democrats of working people has led to a significant rise in support for the right wing, with many looking for an alternative to the broken status quo. This has also concretely posed the threat of a second Trump presidency. The same process has been playing out in Europe, where the far right is making major gains, including in the recent European Union elections. The rise of the right wing here and internationally shows how urgently we need new parties for working people, independent of the parties of the ruling class. In the United States, we need to provide a working class alternative to the parties of Biden and Trump. Workers Strike Back is calling for national protests and strikes this August to coincide with the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. We will be holding a rally there on Tuesday, August 20th, where we will be joined by independent left presidential candidate, anti-war candidate, Jill Stein, who has taken a consistent stand against the war. Workers Strike Back members have been actively organizing in their unions and their communities to reject both Biden and Trump in November, and to build the movement to end the war on Gaza. And on that note, welcome, Joan. Thank you for joining On Strike.
Thank you.
So, Joan, to start with, can you tell us what do you think is necessary to end the war on Gaza, and what is the specific role of the labor movement in it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to start with just the reality that what's happening in Gaza is truly unimaginable. It's a complete catastrophe. Just this week, the New York Times, for example, called it a hellscape, right, referring to the incessant bombing and shelling that has been happening, that's been leaving multitudes of people dead, injured, or maimed.
And the story talked about the multiple amputations
Yeah.
that are being carried out.
Yeah, it's really horrific, and I think it's impacting a lot of people, and people are seeing this violence and this catastrophe happening and wanting to do something about it, which I think is important for us to understand, like what the root causes of the crisis are, which is fundamentally, right, going back not just to this immediate crisis, but to underlying it, the Israeli occupation of Palestine itself, which has been happening for decades, has been escalating basically nonstop to where we're seeing today, which again is completely unimaginable and horrifying. And I think and then people are really waking up to sort of seeing the brutal violence that's occurring. And also understanding that this occupation is made possible and enabled by the United States, right? Especially Western-backed imperialism that is arming the Israeli state, which is by far the strongest military in the region, with billions upon billions of dollars of military funding. This includes the latest round of funding, the $15 billion that the U.S. Approved back in April. But this military funding goes back decades, right? This goes back a very long time. I think in total, right, it's above like $100 billion directly to military funding to Israel, which is truly staggering considering we don't have funding in the U.S. for things like Medicare for all or free education, but we do have seemingly endless amounts of money for military funding for bombs to attack Palestinian civilians. And also understanding that this military funding has been a bipartisan issue, right? Both Democrats and Republicans have consistently supported this military funding, and by extension have supported the occupation of Palestine by the Israeli state, which leads to the really important conclusion that if we really want to stop the war, if we want to stop the underlying causes of it, we are going to need an independent movement that's separate from both of the parties of big business, the Democrats and the Republicans, right? We're going to need an independent force that can stop it. And that force is the labor movement, right? It is the independent working class, both internationally, but here in the United States, to fight against this occupation, to fight against this military funding, and to fight against this imperialism. And also understanding that for the labor movement and workers here in the U.S., when we talk about military funding, when we talk about $100 billions getting sent, most of that goes to executives of major U.S. corporations like Boeing, right? It ends up in their pocket, right? It's not going to, of course we know this, it's not going to actually help people. It's getting sent to send bombs to Palestine, but that money is ultimately going into the same corporations that are attacking U.S. workers, attacking unions here in the United States. I think we can point to Boeing, for example, that's a huge beneficiary of this military funding, and just look at the union struggles that are happening this year, in fact, with workers at Boeing. So, for example, with Boeing workers with the International Association of Machinists are going on to fight for their first contract this year in 16 years after the union leadership forced the same contract on them. And so they've had the same contract for 16 years. At a Seattle Workers Strike Back meeting, we actually had one of these workers come and talk to us about this contract. It was really inspiring to sort of hear these workers gearing up for this fight after most of them have never been actually, at the bargaining table across from Boeing, fighting for better working conditions for themselves. And similarly, just recently, in the last few weeks, firefighters that work for Boeing who are, again, fighting for better working standards, for better working conditions, Boeing took this really blatant anti-union move and locked those workers out, attempting to undercut their their bargaining and sort of attack them that way to sort of force them to accept worse conditions.
And so the same executives and shareholders, the same billionaires and multimillionaires who are benefiting from the horrific war on Gaza are also the ones who are blatantly anti-worker, as you described. I mean, going after these firefighters, locking them out for having the temerity of rejecting a contract, I believe.
And I was going to say, I mean, what a move to lock out firefighters in a corporation and industry that have been in the headlines for safety crises over and over again this year.
Yeah, which I think when we talk about what can the labor movement do to fight to end the war, what that is a class struggle strategy that sees that both of these fights are connected, right? And labor unions were for a long time not just centers of like economic power that really could put their weight, and force corporations to give their workers better conditions and wages, but also as like political weapons, right? And so, for example, right, launching a political struggle led by rank and file members of unions could put their stamp on events like this. I think, for example, we could point to things like the Vietnam War movement as an example to sort of see a similar parallel. In the recent period, in the last few decades, though, we've seen a really big decline in this approach, right? Instead of taking what we would call a class struggle approach, instead going more towards a business unionism that really shies away from any form of political struggle, that just purely sees the purpose of the union is just to negotiate wages between the immediate workers and the bosses, right?
And even there, not to actually fight for the best wages and working conditions, but trying to find peace with the bosses, trying to find some mutual agreement with the bosses, which is completely missing the point that the interests of the two classes are diametrically opposed to one another.
Exactly. And that strategy is fundamentally underlying one of the reasons why unions have been in such rapid decline over the past few decades. But we are seeing a little bit of a turn in that, right? In fact, we're even seeing workers taking up explicitly political and anti-war calls in their unions. I think the biggest example of this would be we saw the campus, the student protest movement and the encampments across. The numbers are pretty broad, right? This got sparked sort of in New York at Columbia, but they spread not just across the entire country, but even internationally, really rapidly. And that included not just students, but also workers on those campuses, right? The people that actually make these campuses run as actual like educational institutions where people can live and get their education. Those workers also participated in the encampments and the protests. And beyond just individual workers and students getting active in these encampments and these protests, we've even started seeing entire unions take a stand, right, which is an enormous step forward. I believe you were just talking about the UCLA workers with UAW 4811 that authorized a strike to fight against the police repression and the academic repression of protesters, right, and these union workers, which is an enormous step forward, something that we haven't seen in a very long time, which indicates that, right, there is this growing sentiment among rank and file workers pushing for unions to take a more political role, seeing themselves not just as and seeing their unions not just as sort of a place where they can, negotiate a better contract and better wages or better working conditions, but an actual political force that can make its stamp on the important political questions of the day. And right now, that being the anti-war movement. And obviously, this has been really emphasized and seen from these academic workers on campuses. But we've even seen some non-academic and campus workers take a stand on this as well. That is another inspiring, heroic stand for workers to take. I think one example that stands out to me is as these protesters were facing police repression in New York, the bus drivers in New York with TWU Local 100 refused this demand that they would transport arrested protesters that the police were calling for them to do, and said, "We are against this. It's not in our contract. We refuse to do this." I think that is another.
That's inspiring.
Yeah, it's really inspiring, and that's the kind of not just class struggle, but political action that workers want to take up, right? But understanding that it is a struggle, right? The union leadership is not necessarily always going to be on board with those actions, that this is going to be a movement from rank and file workers pushing for this kind of change. Which sort of goes to indicate that the labor movement is reemerging as a political force that can make a decisive impact on ending the war. But fundamentally, that is going to take a class struggle leadership, right? We can't continue going forward with this business union leadership that we've had for the last few decades that has undermined rank and file workers, undermined the sort of democratic basis upon which the unions were formed. We need a new class struggle leadership, and one that's willing to use the strike as a tool to fight for these things. Because ultimately, that is what's going to stop executives at Boeing, presidents at universities. They're going to want to implement the agenda that continues the political status quo. And we as workers and as union members, we need to use our power to stop that, to put forward our own working class struggle strategy. And ultimately, that is going to be based upon the collective power that we have in the strike.
And ultimately, we need this type of strike action to end the war.
Right.
Unless we have mass strike action by the labor movement as a whole, shutting down the profit machine of U.S. capitalism, it is not going to be possible to end the war. And that's why, as Worker Strike Back members, all of us have been calling for a nationally coordinated one-day strike action and walkout, which includes both students and workers.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm really happy to call for that. I know I've been talking with workers and students who see the need for a coordinated action like this, right? That there's an absolutely a hunger for some sort of, coordinated action that we can take.
An escalation. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's not what we're seeing from the union leadership right now. And that's absolutely not what we're seeing from the Democrats, obviously, because they have no interest in, working class people seeing the power that they have. They actually want to hide that from us.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really agree, Joan. I think it was an excellent point you made that really what's needed is a leadership of, class struggle ideas and methods, including seeing the strike not as, a last resort or something to be avoided at all costs, but as the most powerful weapon that workers have, both in winning the strongest contracts, but also in winning, broader political and social demands. And in a situation where often the elected union leadership doesn't represent those class struggle ideas and methods, it is up to rank and file workers and union members to be bringing those ideas and methods forward and fighting for those ideas. So could you tell us a little bit about the resolution that you put forward in your union? And I'm curious what the response to that was like, both from the union leadership and from rank and file union members.
Yeah, I'm really happy to talk about it. So my union, OPIU Local 153, has over 10,000 members in it, representing a variety of different workplaces, one of which is a significant number of campus and academic workers, including some unions at campuses where there was substantial police repression of encampments and student protesters, such as Rutgers or UPenn or Emory, for example. In the face of this horrifying police repression that got unleashed on peaceful protesters, a group of us in my union, we decided that we wanted our union to join not only the call for a ceasefire that multiple unions have taken up at this point, but also taking a stand against this police repression in solidarity with these students and workers that are facing punishment and state and police repression for peacefully protesting this horrific catastrophe that's happening in Gaza. But I think there's a real question. I think a lot of workers want to go forward and want their unions to take a stand on this, but it is a real question. It's it's not the easiest thing to do. I don't think the union leadership makes it the most intentionally, I think makes it not very clear how to write a resolution, how to bring forward a resolution, how to organize something democratically in your union, right? I think as we were talking about before, this sort of business unionism mentality that purely sees a union as this vehicle for, just negotiating wages.
And really like transacting, doing a transaction with the bosses as opposed to a fighting organ. And because of that approach by business unionist leadership, they don't see a real role for the rank and file, right? They don't see any space where they can get activated. And so my experience as a member of the teachers union also was that everything was obscure, like even the process, right? How do you even bring forward a resolution?
Yeah, and I think that's, I think the word you used there, transaction, is completely correct. That's the overriding sentiment, right? And I think it is a big question. But fortunately, I think as a member of Workers Strike Back, this is something that we've been talking about consistently since the crisis started back in October. We've been talking about bringing forward resolutions in our workplaces. We in fact even had an entire meeting here in Seattle dedicated to this. One to the genocidal war happening in Gaza, but also specifically with this sort of call to action about we should be bringing forward resolutions in our unions. And we talked about some of these things. I was really inspired. I personally had never brought forward a resolution in my union before, and I was inspired to sort of hear the experience of other union members talk about how they did this and succeed. And specifically in that meeting, heard from a successful example of union members doing this, and AFSCME Council 28 and WFC Local 889 passed the resolution that we were talking about in Workers Strike Back. In fact, Josie, who's a Workers Strike Back activist, I think has been on this show before, was there in sort of this breakout room, sort of talking about how this happened in her union, and that was really inspiring. And so once this campus repression happened, and my union members were talking about doing something about it, was sort of ready to sort of be, oh, great, there is something we can do about this. Let's pass a resolution. Let's organize our workers.
You were ready for it because you had already been in that discussion at the Workers Strike Back meeting and hearing from other workers. I believe we even had a model resolution at that meeting that we were distributing to anyone who was interested in putting forward a ceasefire resolution in their union, right?
Yeah, that's completely correct. And so as soon as this discussion started happening, it was very helpful to sort of, instead of getting bogged down and maybe all right, let's take time out of our busy, working class lives to write out a full resolution. To sort of have a model resolution that we could sort of look at and say, yes, we all agree with this. And of course, we democratically made some adjustments to it. Specifically, we wanted to emphasize the campus repression and stand in solidarity with these students and workers that were facing this repression. So we added some parts to it. We modified some parts collectively, but sort of having the bones, the foundation, and having sort of also the vision about absolutely, we should be able to do this, set us up to just sort of hit the ground running and not sort of get bogged down in, incidental sort of organizational details, which I think is where a lot of this stuff has a hard time getting going because, we're all workers, we have working class lives, it's difficult to find a group of people that not just have the desire to sort of fight to make their unions into a political, to be the political body that they should be, but also to, have to write out a resolution, for example. But ultimately, I think when we think about a resolution in your union, I think a lot of workers don't necessarily have even context for sort of why they would do that or have personal experience, sort of writing a resolution or organizing their coworkers. But fundamentally, right, going forward, understanding this class struggle strategy that we were talking about earlier, that our unions should be a larger political force, for example, to join this anti-war movement. It's really fundamentally the same principle as a union taking a collective decision to go on strike, to do a strike authorization vote, to accept a contract agreement. It's the same concept, right?
And actually, this is a very important point you're making, Joan, because having a class struggle based union and class struggle ideas in the leadership are important not only for us, for the union leadership and the rank and file to be able to see their role as also seeing themselves as playing a historic role in something like the anti-war movement, but that same class struggle basis is needed to win anything in the workplace. So we don't really make a distinction, like when we talk about what is the best kind of union to have, it is the class struggle based union, and those ideas underpin anything that workers need, whether it is wages and working conditions and benefits like healthcare, or it is taking a stand against the war, let alone actually having an anti-war movement that has a strategy to win.
I was also thinking, just while you guys were talking about how kind of opaque the process for introducing a resolution often is. It's not something most workers are familiar with, and the union leadership kind of intentionally doesn't make that information available to everyone. The whole fundamental idea of what a union is and what it's supposed to be, right, is an organization of the rank and file workers for them to be active, for them to have ownership of, right? And I think the culture that we hear about so many times from so many guests on this show is one where union members kind of feel like their job is to, wait for directions from the union leadership and sort of respect whatever process is happening and not rock the boat and not kind of make too many demands. And that's just such a real shame and the opposite of the type of culture that we should have in healthy unions, where the union members should feel like this is my space to feel empowered and to, put demands on the leadership, to say, I want to bring forward a resolution. How do I do that? Ask questions, be loud, demand your right to fully participate and play a role. And, especially I think for so many women workers, just given the way that we're socialized, right? That idea of demanding and being loud and kind of forcing your way into playing an active role can be really intimidating. But that's exactly what we need, right? And that's something workers should see as a positive thing, right? That's the kind of rank and file class struggle mood and culture that we need, I think, in the unions.
Yeah, completely agreed. And I think was definitely the sentiment at the Seattle Workers Strike Back meeting where we talked about this, was there were a lot of workers and people that were enthusiastic, but just sort of felt like they had no even concept about where to start. And
which also shows you the role that Workers Strike Back is playing, where we can actually give an actual vision for what a union should be like. Workers Strike Back is not a union for any workers, but union members can actually come to Workers Strike Back meetings, become members of Workers Strike Back, and we can help figure out how you can actually bring resolutions related to the war against the war in your union. How can you actually, and it's not just that, right? We were talking about class struggle strategy needed for everything. So the next time, if you're watching this show and next time your union is in contract negotiations, and if you want to figure out how do you organize your fellow rank and file into a more fighting approach, maybe even going on strike to win some really important demands related to your wages and working conditions, then you should contact Workers Strike Back, because this is the kind of discussion we do, the kind of discussion that Joan is talking about.
Exactly.
And you were, when you and I were talking, Joan, you mentioned how the language, the political substance of the resolution itself played a big role in winning over your fellow rank and file, and also making it very difficult for some union leaders who might otherwise have wanted to oppose the resolution.
yeah, and I think that's a really important part of a successful, collectively organizing and passing a successful resolution, is having a strong political basis for it, so that when someone reads the resolution, they can very quickly identify it, but also that anticipates some concerns that people might have, because I think we want to be clear, right? This isn't sort of just something that we want to force people to, or sort of hide what we're doing. We want people to feel confident, want people to feel activated and energized by a resolution. And I think that's exactly what this resolution did.
And feel able to take ownership, right?
Exactly.
Suggest changes or feel like they're reflected in it. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, we had some back and forth discussion about how best to, what it means to stand in solidarity with student protesters, academic workers that are facing this repression. One member suggested signing on to a call from signing on to a statement from the Columbia Academic Workers Union that they were requesting solidarity. Another person sort of brought up this great idea that in addition to sort of making a public statement, we should actually mobilize our union members out to the court trials of students that are currently like in court facing criminal charges for protesting.
That's a great idea.
Exactly. And that's sort of the basis upon which a resolution can get passed, right? Is when it is on the strength of a collective organization of workers wanting to fight for something together. And that's sort of the approach that we took, which was instead of trying to figure out sort of the union bylaws and sort of like try to use like a procedural
and get bogged down in process.
Yeah, how do we sort of like get this done? I think we looked at it and made sure that we were following the process to the best of our understanding, but we didn't just sort of like only focus on bylaws. We just like took the approach of feeling confident about this resolution and talking to our coworkers. So in my bargaining unit, we have monthly meetings where we just come together and talk as workers. And we just sort of looked at the resolution, talked about it. Some people suggested changes, brought up some concerns. So for example, I think there were some concerns shared about like, oh, are we supposed to do things like this as a union? Like this sort of like a political, like what does this have to do with us?
Is this our role?
Yeah, is this our role? And I think also some people feeling some hesitation or concern about sort of, stepping into a political stance, right? That potentially it might be incorrect or there might be something they might get attacked for it. But working through and talking through those concerns, we were able to get a democratic agreement that we wanted to collectively endorse this. And I think that rests on this. Ultimately, one of the things that I think is really strong about the resolution is identifying the root cause of the crisis and saying that ultimately what's going to be necessary to not just win a ceasefire, but end the war is a stop to the occupation, a stop to military funding, and the labor movement taking this step to fight for this. While at the same time also understanding that extends towards Israeli working class citizens, and that the solution to the crisis is not terrorism against Israeli citizens, but is instead going to be an international working class anti-war movement that can shut down the ultimate causes of the war itself. I think that went really far to assuaging some concerns that people had about the resolution, about taking this political step, firmly rooted on this, again, like international working class basis that is, correct politically what we would identify as the main source, the origin of the crisis itself.
I think that's so important because, people all the way up to President Biden have been just using this blanket sort of accusation of anti-Semitism against anyone who's protesting the war. And, he labeled the student protests anti-Semitic. And, I think most working people very genuinely do not want to be anti-Semitic. And so it is understandable that people would want to look at the resolution language closely, right? And make sure that that is not in there, that that's not what it's saying. And by identifying concretely the causes and pointing to the need for an international movement that includes also working class Israelis, and pointing to the need for an end to the physical and economic occupation, that does answer that question, I think, clearly, and takes away that space for it to be kind of distorted and framed as somehow anti-Semitic. Yeah.
And in fact, and it's really important that Joan is talking about the role that the political substance of the resolution and the accuracy, the historical accuracy, and the balance that it provided to keep at bay such false attacks. I think it really came from the work that we also originally did in our Socialist City Council office, because the resolution that has been passed in Joan's union and Josie's union is modeled after the resolution that we brought forward through our City Council office. And I'm sharing this because Joan's comments reminded me of how when we were trying to get the support of many different activist organizations for our resolution, and a few of them, in my view, incorrectly, refused to support our resolution because it had a critique of the ideas of terrorism and that it did not support Hamas, and which we don't. We don't support Hamas because it's a reactionary, right-wing, anti-worker, anti-union, entity. It's a force that is actually very hostile to the working class. And the resolution language emphasized that the only path, as Joan is saying, the only path forward is for Palestinian working people and for Israeli working people and for internationally for the working class to fight against imperialism as a whole, against capitalism as a whole. And we also pointed out that actually in the attacks by Hamas in October, there were also many Arab and Bedouin people who were killed, and this is not the way to have any solution. This does not provide any solution to the crisis or to the war. And it's also important at the same time that, and Joan pointed towards this earlier, that the overwhelming emphasis of the resolution is about the imperialism and the violence instigated by the Israeli state, and not that the Israeli state operates by itself. It's with the backing of US and Western imperialism, and that it would not be able to carry out this kind of genocidal war were it not for the support, both economic and political support, from Western powers.
And again, I think the political strength of this resolution, exactly, Shama, as you sort of really hammered out, going through this process of discussing it with Palestinian groups and Jewish groups, really lent towards the success of getting this passed in my union and our union. So after we went to our, so this was sort of a group of activists in a few different bargaining units. We'd all gone to our bargaining units and collected endorsements. I think almost we just over like a course of a few weeks had collected almost 100 endorsements from bargaining units and individual endorsers. And so sort of on that basis of demonstrating that there was a collective support for this, we brought it to the union leadership to say, all right, here's our next general membership meeting. We want to discuss this and we want to take a vote on it. And sort of had the resolution in addition with all the signatories, and sort of to demonstrate that this had a broad democratic support. Obviously, we weren't going to be able to have an individual conversation with all 10,000 members of the union, but this is the sort of basis upon which you can demonstrate this support. I think the initial reaction to us sort of introducing this and bringing this resolution forward was some hesitation, definitely a sense of oh my gosh. Really, I think, again, sort of talking about the union leadership not wanting to sort of enter into this political terrain, really hesitant to it. And instead of sort of discussing it and voting on it in the general membership meeting, said, all right, well, let's talk about it in a committee. And I think we were rightfully skeptical, concerned that this would be sort of an attempt to sort of just let the resolution.
And it often is. We've seen that often, but not only from some labor leaders, but also from the Democratic Party politicians.
Exactly. It's sort of...
whenever we say we need a minimum wage increase, or we need renters' rights, or we need taxes on big business, they say, oh, let's set up a committee
to study it. Yeah.
Exactly. And instead of discussing it in front of the membership, instead of just letting the membership vote on it, let's bring it to sort of a more select group. And so I think we were skeptical about this approach and disappointed. But again, I think the political strength of the resolution itself carried this momentum forward. So the union leadership couldn't find any sort of firm basis in the face of this support from rank and file members to say that we couldn't go forward with it. And in fact, once I think they sort of realized it and saw that there was this groundswell of support, got on board and said, all right, I think we're on board. Let's go forward.
And that was because of the work you guys had done, you and your coworkers, ahead of time of discussing the resolution with your coworkers in different, bargaining units across the union, getting those initial signatures and endorsements so that, like you said, there was no way for the union leadership to
ignore it.
Yeah.
Exactly, and take it seriously. So we were able to pass the resolution. I think, unfortunately, though, the way that it was passed wasn't through a democratic vote of the membership, which I think is how these resolutions should be discussed, should be brought before the broader membership for discussion and voting democratically. Right. It was sort of selectively discussed in a committee and then voted on by the executive leadership. And so we do actually absolutely want to push unions to be more democratic, that this should be a decision made by the membership. This should be a discussion that rank and file members have a say over and have a voice over and have a vote.
So in a way, as you both were alluding to earlier, the fact that the leadership felt compelled to pass this resolution in their own body without the whole membership present showed the momentum behind the resolution, and they knew the writing was on the wall, that the membership was strongly supporting it. On the other hand, the most powerful way that we can win a resolution is if members end up actually voting and having a debate and discussion about it and voting. So yeah, I really agree with you.
So Joan, what do you think kind of more broadly are the concrete next steps for building a stronger labor movement going forward this year?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. And I think extending on from, what a resolution in a union is a big victory, but we have to understand that one resolution needs to have follow through, and it needs to be joined by a broader coordinated action across multiple unions.
Right.
Ultimately, right, this is in progress of rebuilding a fighting political labor movement. One of the things, that we've talked about is that Workers Strike Back. We want to call for, not just a resolution in solidarity with the ceasefire and against police repression, but mobilizing union workers and union members out to this call that Workers Strike Back is organizing for a one-day national strike and walkout to, follow through on this and show that there's muscle behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be a crucial thing for all the unions that have, and where the rank and file members like yourself have passed ceasefire solidarity resolutions. Absolutely, that is a very important next step.
Yeah, and as a part of that, extending that even further would be understanding that the union, our unions and the labor movement needs to also reject this sort of complacency or this statement that we just need to support the Democratic Party and let the Democratic Party do this organizing for us. Right. We've seen that time and time again that the Biden administration, one, of course, is like the main enabler of the genocidal war in Gaza, but has absolutely no interest in organizing working people to fight for these sort of things. And that's why Workers Strike Back is calling for our members, individuals, but also entire unions collectively to mobilize for the DNC in August as a really important part of fighting for an independent labor movement that joins with the anti-war movement that we're seeing rapidly escalate. I think this is so key for us understanding that Biden has been a key enabler of the genocidal war in Gaza, and that it's not enough for unions or the labor movement to call for a ceasefire, but then still endorse Biden.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's like you're taking the step to build pressure, but then immediately just walking it back, and I think
completely contradictory.
There's, I assume, just a huge amount of kind of built up frustration. So many of the ceasefire resolutions that have been passed have been, like in your union, rank and file led efforts, because there is such broad anger at the continued military aid, to the genocidal war by Biden. But then most of the union endorsements of Biden are made in an extremely top-down way, right? So there's like these competing pressures from the rank and file to reject Biden's ongoing role supporting the war, and from the union leadership to, continue supporting Biden and maintaining that close relationship with the Democratic Party. And I think that's something that, rank and file union members really need to keep pushing on and not accept that, we're just going to let those contradictions exist within our union and let the union leadership kind of pull the rug out from under the pressure we've been trying to build with our efforts from below.
Yeah, exactly. And I know On Strike has been talking about this recently. I think especially was really proud to see On Strike ask Shawn Fain this question directly at Labor Notes.
Shawn Fain being the president of the UAW union.
Correct. Is it hypocritical? Is it a contradiction to call for a ceasefire, but then on the same breath endorse Biden, which I think is absolutely a critical question that we should be asking all union leaders that have signed on to ceasefire resolutions as well. And I know recently another worker strike back activist, Joe, was on the show to talk about the rescind Biden endorsement that they put forward at the WEA recently, and talking to other working class teachers to rescind that endorsement of Biden in the face of this, not just genocidal war on Gaza, but also the brutal cuts that the Democratic Party has been making to education here in Washington, for example. And I think this ultimately connects up to the necessity of the labor movement rejecting both Biden and Trump in the presidential election this year. We understand that a second Trump presidency would be a disaster. It would be much worse for working class and oppressed people than the first presidency. But ultimately, we know that voting for Biden is not going to stop that. Right. And also fundamentally that our unions collectively donate massive amounts of money to the Democratic Party, when instead that money should be going towards organizing the unorganized, rebuilding a fighting labor movement, the kind of labor movement that can use strikes, can use collective power to concretely stop this right-wing agenda from Trump.
And building for the first time a new political party that is actually based on the strength of working people and the organized labor movement that can help fight for those demands, help bring those demands into the political arena, instead of the current situation where, neither of the parties on offer have any interest in representing the interests or the views of ordinary working people.
Yeah, in fact, that's what's caused this bigger opening for the right wing. And even if Trump were not to get elected this year, Trumpism as a phenomenon and the growth of the right wing is not going to be stopped as long as people are just asked to swing from Democrats to Republicans with no real alternative for a working class fighting force in the form of a new party.
Right. So Joan, I know you also identify as a socialist. So could you tell us a little bit about how you became a socialist and how you first got active in political organizing here in Seattle?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to share the story. So when I moved to Seattle, I'm originally from Utah. I think pretty common story for queer people in Seattle, migrating to sort of find a more safer spot. I would consider myself to, wanting to find like a political organization to fight with, but not really finding or really having, even like the self-confidence to think that I could play a role. But one of my first memories moving to Seattle was going to my local grocery store and being outside, handed a flyer for a tax Amazon public meeting. I think it was a launch event or an event close to the start. And
this must have been the event that we did in January of 2020, where we combined our city council inauguration for our
with the tax Amazon rally.
The tax Amazon launch.
Yeah, I think that was the one.
And this, by the way, just for viewers who don't know, this inauguration and the launch of the tax Amazon movement came on the heels of us winning our re-election in 2019, which was our third election victory. And that it was really remarkable because that was in the face of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, the corporate landlords, other corporations really just going on the attack, spending millions of dollars to try and defeat us, with the progressive Democrats running their own candidate against us, saying, I'm going to be like Sharma, but I'm just going to be nice.
But nicer.
But nicer, yeah. And then we were able to actually mobilize thousands of working people to win that election, and then we launched the Tax Amazon movement. And I'm so glad you got that flyer.
Me too. And yeah, without even knowing that sort of background, I was immediately intrigued. I think just sort of the slogan, right? Tax Amazon was such a bold, inspiring statement that I was immediately intrigued. Somewhat embarrassingly, though, I didn't see myself as really playing a role. I didn't get involved, but I kept that flyer. And in fact, through the course of the Tax Amazon movement, I actually encountered more activists time and again. One time I was just, I think, in a park, and someone walked up and had the ballot initiative to sign, and said, "Oh, do you want to sign this? We're organizing to tax Amazon to fund affordable housing and a Green New Deal programs in Seattle." And I was, again, stunned. I was like, "Oh, this is incredible organizing, and it's so inspiring to see." But still, I think having a difficult time, like sort of seeing myself as being an activist, and maybe not having the confidence to sort of like step into something.
And that's not something to be embarrassed about, though, Joan. I mean,
was
I
just
think
gonna
that's
say that,
the reality for the overwhelming majority of people is you're not taught in school, you're not shown examples of how to really be politically active and involved. And in most cities, there's no one in the local government who is doing what, you did with your office, Shama, of doing constant outreach and trying to mobilize people into City Hall to be part of the legislative process.
And all of which raises the confidence of every individual activist there.
So it's no coincidence, and it's certainly not a personal failure that was kind of your starting point. That's how we're all conditioned to feel about politics.
I'm actually glad we had this conversation. I'm glad that you mentioned this, because I'm sure that what you're saying about how you felt is how most young people feel.
Yes.
And we want them to not be held back by that, and actually get involved with Worker Strike Back.
Yeah, and I think it was the victory, right? Seeing a real concrete victory happen, sort of like right before my eyes, that convinced me that, like, okay, maybe I don't feel confident in myself, but I feel confident in these politics. I feel confident in doing this, and sort of seeing, I think if I'm remembering correctly, that it was the ballot initiative in just sort of 20 days that collected, I think, like 20,000 signatures, and seeing it firsthand, like this enormous organizing feat, and seeing this working class movement take on a corporation like Amazon and win was just so inspiring. Especially, I think, the sort of bold, heroic approach of not trying to persuade Democrats on the city council, but just using the collective power of working class people in Seattle to fight Amazon. Really, I know we say this with Workers Strike Back, right? The slogan, like, when we fight, we can win. That was the moment, seeing that happen, is not just when I sort of like understood it, but like felt it, and was, for the first time, like really believed it and knew that that's what I wanted to do. And since then, I've been proud to, see this strategy led by socialists, right? This class struggle strategy. I've been proud to call myself a socialist and call myself, a fighter for the same for the working class. And also, I think that sort of leads directly into why I am so proud to be an activist with Workers Strike Back and what we're building here.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head, Joan, when you talked about both the power of the collective, efforts, fight back by the working class in the Tax Amazon movement, but at the same time, that movement being led by socialists with socialist ideas, socialists who have, we've talked about this class struggle ideas and class struggle strategy, fighting strategy a lot today. And this is what we mean by all of that. We mean, as you said, Joan, not putting faith in the Democratic Party politicians, which we didn't. 8 Democrats on the city council. We are 1 socialist. We didn't, because we know that they are not on our side, that the Democratic Party is.
And how many people were telling us along the way, including many well-meaning people and, people who've spent decades working in NGOs and different political activist groups saying, well, you can't really get anything done if you don't win over the Democrats on the council because you're just one socialist. So really you need to think about, what are they going to be willing to accept? How do you win them over? How do you get them on board? And
which is really a recipe for selling out.
We never took that advice, and were able to win.
It's the best advice we ignored.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I'm glad you pointed out how the boldness of the slogan Tax Amazon really struck you. I think that was another, remember, Kaylin, there was another point of debate among the leaders of the movement, the kind of leaders you're talking about, who may even be well-meaning, some of them, but they don't want to fight back, and they really didn't want
to antagonize Amazon. They were saying, let's do something that everyone can be on board with, like
employee hours tax,
something
or
like things that
so technocratic slogans
wouldn't
that,
upset anyone, wouldn't provoke a really harsh response, and it
but
was
it's,
really
but it's really it's a mistaken idea, because it's based on this idea that we could win, and here's where the well-meaning part of it comes, right? They also wanted to win the tax, but they mistakenly thought that if only we didn't have a slogan that would antagonize Amazon, we could slip it under the radar. In fact, there were many.
They wouldn't notice us taking their money.
They literally said, they would slip it under the radar, like the CEOs and Jeff Bezos himself. They're so stupid that they would not notice that we're fighting for a tax that would tax them to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, in addition to the employee hours tax, there was another term called the head tax. I mean, these were like supposed to be technically accurate terminology.
I remember,
but actually, when they used the word term head tax, it actually was counterproductive, because then the corporate media, which is no friend to us, working people, ended up using that and distorting its meaning, literally lying about it, saying, oh, that's a tax on actual working people, which it absolutely wasn't.
Right. Yeah, no, it's less politically clear to call it a head tax, because specifically what we were saying was a tax on only the biggest, wealthiest corporations in the city. And calling it the Amazon tax makes that clear, because everyone knows that Amazon is the biggest, wealthiest corporation in the city. And by taking away that content in supposedly the interest of, not upsetting anyone, really you're removing your ability to make it clear to working people the class basis of what we're fighting for. And that actually, I think, like Joan is a perfect example. It was that making it clear we're talking about taxing the rich people, the rich corporations, is what made the campaign appealing to people and what allowed us to get so much support in such a short period of time.
And I think this approach that we took, the Tax Amazon movement took, is the same approach that we're taking with the anti-war movement right now, with these resolutions for calling for a ceasefire, right? Having the courage to call out that the root of the problem is, the Israeli occupation of Palestine and military funding to the Israeli state is something that people, I think a lot of people would be hesitant to sort of boldly claim.
And we're not even stopping there. We're, as you pointed out earlier, we're also pointing out that Biden is the warmonger in chief right now. So how could we support Biden? And
I think that sort of bold, courageous, but again, a correctly political approach that does call out our class enemies, the people that are the cause of these problems, is what inspires people. So in passing my resolution, I wouldn't have been able to do it by myself. It was because other union activists, not in my bargaining unit, went to their bargaining units, collected signatures, argued for this resolution, the same way that with the Tax Amazon initiative, 20,000 people signed on because they saw this approach and wanted to be a part of it. That is the strength. When we talk about a class struggle strategy, that is where it derives its strength, from when hundreds, thousands, even millions of people collectively see, have the same vision to fight our collective enemies, that we can accomplish enormous amounts, We can win a tax on Amazon. We can stop the war, the genocidal war happening in Gaza. That is what's possible when we say we fight. When we fight, we can win. That's what we're saying.
Right. And when we agree to compromise on not even saying what it is we want, not even putting our real demands out there, that is what makes it impossible, It's only impossible if we accept that it's impossible, if we accept that we won't even put out there the demand that we actually all collectively are aiming for. And it was the exact same way, if I remember, with the ceasefire resolution in the Seattle City Council. I remember so many people who came to speak in public comment, hundreds and hundreds of people in the middle of a, weekday, people took time off work to be there.
Tuesday afternoon.
And many of them said, it's not just that this is a ceasefire resolution, and it's not just that I want an end to the war that's happening now, but they talked about how our resolution called for an end to the occupation of Palestinian lands, and it called for an end to U.S. military funding. And they said this is actually points to the practical steps that are necessary to accomplish this goal of ending the war. And so many people right now are calling for an end to the war, but they're not willing to to say, okay, what are the concrete practical steps necessary to make that happen? And the fact that our resolution did that made it feel more serious to people and made people more motivated to come out and help fight to win it.
Absolutely. And we had many leaders, NGO leaders, I would call them gatekeepers really, who really wanted us to eliminate many of those aspects from the resolution because they thought that if we did that, that would become more palatable to the Democrats and that way we could win. And they kept asking this question, do you have 5 votes? You know, in a 9-member city council, you need 5 votes at least to win. They kept saying, you don't have 5 votes. With this language, you won't have 5 votes. And it's exactly the approach that Joan used in her union where she mobilized her fellow rank and file to fight for it. That's how we were able to win. But, you know,
Right.
ultimately, remember, on the day of the vote, we had more than 500 people packing City Hall,
Yep. That was incredible.
demanding that the Democrats vote yes, and that's how we won.
You're right. And it is exactly the same because, Joan, you were saying when you first brought your resolution to the leaders of your union, they didn't just read it and immediately say, yep, we're passing this, right? Yeah. They read it. They spent some time trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do about this? And it was only once they realized how much support there was for the resolution and that they wouldn't be able to get away with sort of ignoring it, that then they went back and said, okay, I guess we'll pass this. The Seattle City Council members, when they initially read the resolution,
they were absolutely against
They were not on board. We did not have 5 votes. But
I mean, it's their party that is
exactly. Joe Biden is Democratic president.
So they're not going to take any action against Biden.
And it wasn't until they're faced with those 500 people in City Hall that they realized, okay, we can't get away with not passing this, and they passed it. Yeah.
Right. So what's next for you, Joan, in terms of your work as a union member as part of this anti-war movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, right, concretely, I think it's exactly about following through, right? Not just passing a resolution, but making sure that we follow through and using our power to fight for these things, right? As you were just talking about, mobilizing out to a city hall meeting, city council meeting, we need to mobilize out to the DNC, right? So I think the next step for the labor movement, for union members, is to fight for this, right? To mobilize as many people out to protest the DNC, to protest the Biden administration, to protest the genocidal war happening in Gaza, as the next step to building a broader anti-war movement and a next step towards building, a coherent force that is the basis upon which we could actually build a new party for working people. And I think as a concrete step towards building that party, that we should be advocating for a vote for the most viable anti-war candidate in the presidential election this year, which is Jill Stein, and that we should be arguing this within our unions, right, rescinding the endorsement of Biden and fighting for the strongest left candidate in the election as the basis for this new party of working people.
And at Worker Strike Back's first national Zoom conference on July 21st, I believe, I know Jill Stein has just confirmed that she will be able to attend and speak at that national Zoom conference. And we will be discussing many of the things we've been talking about with Joan here today. How do we mobilize our unions out to protest at the DNC? How do we pass ceasefire resolutions, but also resolutions to rescind the union's endorsements of Biden. And also, I think, discussing the question of us as working people, as Workers Strike Back, endorsing Jill Stein as the strongest left independent anti-war candidate. So I hope our viewers can join us on July 21st for that first national Zoom conference.
Thanks so much, Joan, for joining us. Really inspiring story, both of how you became a socialist and became a Worker Strike Back activist, and also how you succeeded in passing this resolution in your union in favor of the ceasefire in Gaza.
Yeah, thank you so much. Happy to be here.
If you've watched On Strike before, you'll know that we provide an analysis from the point of view of working class people about the problems we face in our daily lives under capitalism. In every episode, On Strike also presents a strategy for working class movements to fight back. On Strike talks about why it's crucial that every fight for change emphasizes the need to build working class solidarity and is linked with organizing a powerful challenge to the political establishment and the capitalist system itself. This is something you won't find on mainstream media. That's why we need your support for On Strike. Subscribe to our On Strike channel on YouTube and like this video, and become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement. By becoming a Workers Strike Back member, you can also help this broadcast. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people. Go to workerstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Solidarity.